Hi, my name's Horton and I'm an application engineer for our 3D documentation team here at FARO UK. During this tutorial I'd like to run through the installation procedure for FARO Scene and also show you some of the basic options for setting up the program itself. In order to install FARO Scene, you first need to locate the installation files. Now, if you're a new user and you've recently purchased a FARO Focus or a FARO Freestyle, the software will be contained within the box. Or, if you go to the FARO website, you can either go through the Products drop-down menu, or you can go to the Download Center, or you can keep an eye on the popular downloads to download the latest version of Scene, which for the purposes of this movie is 5.5.0.44203. Depending on how you use FARO Scene, you will definitely need to download the program itself. You may also need to download the SDK if you want to work with third-party applications such as Recap, and you may need to download the WebShare2Go files depending on how you use the software. So once you've downloaded the software, if I go to my installation files here, you can see I've got my installation file at the top. Just beware when downloading that you're actually downloading FARO Scene and you're not downloading Capture or Process. As with every installation on a Windows-based machine, you double click, you select your language and just follow through the prompts. So of course I accept the license terms. Now a little tip here, because I work with multiple versions of Scene on my particular laptop, when I install a new version I always put the version number at the end. This is particularly important if you're working on a large project in say 5.4. It might be advisable to continue that project in 5.4 before you then upgrade it to 5.5, or just leave the project in 5.4. It's completely up to you. So you may need to keep both installations on your machine. If you don't change the installation number at the end, then it will overwrite the previous version and you'll instantly be on the latest version of FARO Scene. So when we've done that, we just click Next, decide whether you want a user manual, which you should do, click Next. Again here I make sure that I'm setting up the program and the shortcut with 5.5 at the end. Click Next. You can decide whether you're going to install Adobe Flash Player, create a desktop icon, or register all your file extensions with this latest version, and then when you're ready, click Install. I would then go further forward and install the latest SDK, which matches the version number of the Scene license that I've just installed. Again, if you're working with something like Recap, you also need to register the DLLs for that SDK. On the YouTube channel there is a tutorial that shows you how to register those DLLs, but also on the laser scanning forum there is a link to this SDK register that's been written by Autodesk that automatically registers your SDK. Just by double clicking on the application you get a command prompt window, and as you can see I've had various versions of Scene installed on this particular machine, but my latest version in here would be Scene 5.5. So I'd merely enter 7 as an installation. When that's done, your installation of Scene should be ready to set up, and your SDKs and your DLL should all be registered. As with every installation of Scene, you will automatically get a 30-day grace period in which to update your license. Updating licenses is only necessary when you're going between sub-single decimal place releases. So for instance, if you're moving from Scene 5.4 to Scene 5.5, you need to update your license. However, if you're moving from Scene 5.5.0 to say 5.5.2, there is no need to update your license because you're still on Scene 5.5. This is done to ensure you only have access to the latest version of software for which you're paying software maintenance for. To update your license, you can either go through the Start menu and into your FARO folder, or you can go through Windows Explorer. Under the FARO Scene 5.5 folder, you'll find FARO RUS executable, which looks like this. To update your license, you merely click on Collect Information. I'll go to my desktop, I'll create a file, and notice here that we're creating a C2V file. If I click Save, the system will create automatically a C2V file. When doing this, if you're working with a dongle, make sure the dongle is plugged in, and you'll get another option which comes up and says SL for software license or HL for hardware license. If you click the HL, it will create your C2V file specifically for your dongle. That needs to then be sent to support@faroeurope.com or your relevant local support office, and in return you will get a V2C file. To apply that, simply save it to your desktop, click on the Apply License button, click on the Browse for Updated File icon here, and go and locate that V2C file and simply apply your license. If you experience any issues doing that, contact your local support office or your local FARO representative. The next thing I always tend to do before I even go and start FARO Scene is I check the options for my video card driver. The preferred solution for FARO Scene is the NVIDIA NVIDIA drivers. So here I've simply started up the NVIDIA control panel, either by right clicking on your desktop or simply typing NVIDIA down your start command down here. And the key setting I always change is under my manage 3D settings. With my laptop I have 2 graphics cards, and against each program in the program settings I can choose what graphics card to use. By default it's typically set at auto select, so the system decides which graphics card it wants to use. But my simple way of looking at this is I've paid for a high-end graphics card, so I want that high-end graphics card to be used for every single program on my machine. Hence I change this option in the global settings rather than at program level. Also, one of the best presets for working with FARO Scene is the 3D app game development option. If you haven't set these and you go into FARO Scene, you may notice things like the clear view mode or the super sampling icon are grayed out, or you don't see any data in the 3D view. These are typical things that you'll see if you haven't set this to be high performance NVIDIA processor. So when I've done that and I know everything's set up, I will then start FARO Scene. Now there are a few key options that I like to change as soon as I've installed Scene. I always walk people through this if ever I'm training them and they're new to Scene. Also I advise existing users if they haven't got things set up in a similar fashion. So when you've first installed Scene, you may see a screen similar to this. I've had to change mine a little just to show you this, but in essence what we need to do is set the file locations for all the projects that you're going to create in Scene, and we do this from the options, which is under the tools menu. So if we go to tools and then options and then we go to folder, as you can see in here I've got multiple locations. So if I just delete those for now, first piece of advice is Scene will work better and more effectively if writing back directly to a solid state hard drive. If you're writing directly to a server, you will find that things may become slow during certain times of the day, or it may take a while to open your Scene project because other people are accessing the network, and hence the streaming of the data becomes quite slow. So what we can do in here is set multiple locations. So for instance, my first location could be my solid state hard drive. So if I click on the icon, you can see on my desktop I've created 3 example folders. So my first example folder is going to be example 1. Click select. That could be my solid state hard drive. Secondly, I may have a location on a D drive, which I do on my machine, where I archive projects to. That could be your server. You're not necessarily writing to those projects, but it means that in your project overview you will see projects from both locations. The first entry here is always a location. When you create a new project in Scene, that's where it will get written to. Now to add in a secondary location, we merely click on the button again, and this time if we go to my desktop and go to example 2 and click select folder, you'll notice that the 2 options now are separated by a semicolon. Now say for instance I wanted to replace both of those and just have example 3 for my desktop. A common mistake is to just click on the icon thinking that it's going to replace both of these entries in here. As you've just seen, by clicking on the icon we're adding in a secondary location. So to add in another primary, if I delete those 2 and then click on the button, I can then go back to my desktop, go to example 3, select folder, and now I've replaced that as the primary location. You can also set up local project folders for your Scene web share and your scanner snapshot location. Moving on to a couple of navigation options here. If I click on the navigation tab, the first thing I always like to change is to invert my mouse wheel. If you don't have that option ticked, when you roll the wheel on your mouse forward, it will zoom out. When you put it back, it will zoom in. By inverting it, as you roll the wheel forward, it will zoom in, which feels more natural to me. Also, my preferred navigation mode is examine when in 3D. By default, the system will be set to fly mode, but I find examine mode more user friendly. The next thing we can change is our preferred units, bearing in mind that we have display units for what we see on the screen. We also have import and export units. I have noticed with certain systems on the market, if I export in meters, when they bring those point clouds in, they're very, very small. So I sometimes have to change this to millimeters to make sure it's correctly scaled. But again, that's down to the system that you're importing data in as to whether they will allow you to specify the measurements of the file that you're importing. Next off, we go and look at some of the registration options. These are accessed under the matching tab and under place scan settings. First off, we can set individual settings for each method of registration, so that by default every time we start up a registration the settings will be set. Pretty much I leave top view and cloud to cloud exactly the same, but in target based these are the only options I have ticked. You may see by default that use points for validation is ticked. I prefer not to have this on because it slows down the registration process, and also I find that if I'm doing manual placements with planes and mean points and things like that, it sometimes makes my registration fail. So with that off, I tend to only like enable correspondence search, use principal direction of scans, and use checkerboard normal set. The General tab applies to all three methods of registration, and the one setting that will be set by default is Enable Auto Clustering. If you're not used to using clusters, then this feature is pretty good for new users. However, if you are used to using clusters, then this particular setting will need to be turned off, because if you've nicely set up your clusters in your workspace in a project and this is ticked, when you go to perform a registration, if the scans don't appear to be in localized locations, then Scene will move them around and move your clusters around to suit what it thinks is best. So I always tend to turn this option off. So once we've finished in there, we'll close that down. The next one, whilst we're in here, is the match sphere settings. Now depending on how you work, whether you're doing top view cloud to cloud or you're working with traditional targets, what we can do in here is add in multiple radii for our spheres. So at the top, the radii for spheres supplied by FARO is 0.0698. If you've purchased spheres from other sources such as Laser Scanning Europe, then the radii of those are 0.0725. Or it might be that you're using larger spheres that are 200. So again, 0.1 would be their radii. This all helps when you're pre-processing pick up spheres, or you're manually selecting your spheres in the system. This just helps the algorithms in the software to look for the sphere size that it requires. So to add another field in here, all you do is simply click below the one above and then start typing. Then when you're happy, just click OK. That pretty much covers the workflow I go through every time I install Scene. The only other thing I tend to do is go and reinstall the applications or apps that I use day in, day out. Thank you for watching. I hope it's been of use, and please feel free to look out for forthcoming movies.